Well, good morning, everyone. I see I got the Friday morning slot. There should be a Bloody Mary bar, I was saying. There'd be more of you here, I bet. It is a great pleasure to speak to this particular group. Much of my work in the last 10 years has involved positing what's going to happen due to the kind of demographic changes, and the demographic revolution is an appropriate term, that's going on around the world. Much of it, of course, has been cast outward from the United States and North America toward the emerging markets, toward the BRICS, the MISTs, and all those other acronyms of doom we hear about. I wanted to bring that a little bit closer to home. But because it's Friday morning, and all of you have been through several days of being spoken to, or at, depending on who did it, I wanted to also start on a more narrative track, a bit of a story. It's a very personal story, and it defines in many ways the way I look at the world. I think who we are and where we came from is an impossible thing to unpack. You cannot remove that filter completely, and I've been very fortunate in that my filter has forced me to be optimistic. My dad was born in Ireland in 1932. We took a trip in the 70s, I'm the oldest of 4 kids, to see where he was born, and it could only be described as prehistoric. It was a stone hut with a dirt floor and a thatch roof and no windows, and the caretaker there happily said, "And we brought the livestock in at night," so they wouldn't wander off. One by one, my dad was the oldest of his own clan as well. His dad, for a variety of reasons, left to seek employment in the United States, leaving the wife and little baby behind. Made enough money, sent for my grandmother, and she left. And so my dad was left with his uncle and aunt, who raised him as if if he were their son. They didn't know if money would show up to send little Eddie, or Eamon as he was then known, to America. And lo and behold, at about 7 or 8, the money did arrive, and he was taken to a Cunard liner, assigned to a nurse, and taken across the Atlantic. And he didn't want to go. And the story goes, my aunt said, "Don't worry, Eddie, you're just going across, and you'll get a bicycle, and you'll come right back." He said, okay. So he got on the liner, and off he went into New York City. You can imagine, 7 years old. This would be the late 1930s. And at the terminal, after he'd been processed through immigration, standing at the end of a gangplank was his biological mother, my grandmother. And she went up to him, as the family story goes, and said, "Sonny boy," and wrapped her arms around him. And he said, "I don't know who you are. Give me my bicycle. I'm going right back to Ireland." And I know this is true because I know my dad. He's fierce. I was lucky to grow up with a guy like that. But I was also lucky that the steps of his life, from a rather poor upbringing in Upper Manhattan, a very large family that mostly born in the U.S. subsequent to his arrival, to his stint in the Marine Corps in Korea. He was a middleweight champion of the Marine Corps in Korea. That's my dad. He was a corporate executive, went to night school at NYU. There is no place in the world to him like America. And I'll say right here to my Canadian friends that I'm just going to use that term in the most pejorative possible sense to refer to my own country. I realize it's a little annoying. I'll try to say U.S. clinically. But at this point, I'm talking about this kind of mystical America that we see in Hollywood movies that actually exists in the minds of many and in the lives of many. That's the country that I am forced to reckon with because of my father. Now, I'm a geostrategist. The world has its currents, its changes, its movements. The U.S. makes mistakes. The U.S. has wonderful qualities, and it's got reprehensible qualities at times. But I need very much, I think, to try to provide a bit of a corrective for what we've seen in the past 10 years. There's a real negative, almost resigned sense in the American public right now, and it shows itself in Pew polls and in Gallup polls that, in fact, I think a majority of Americans recently told Pew, the research arm of Pew, the Pew Foundation, that they thought that China was actually a larger country, larger economy than the United States, which is an absurdity. China is much smaller. It's growing, and it will possibly overtake us in some measures, but it is not a larger economy. There's a degree of defeatism that is injected into the average person's awareness of these things by the fact that the political debate is complex, it is polarized, it's increasingly atomized by the way that the media has developed over the last 15 years, so that if you want to see what Al Jazeera says and that's all you care about, you can go there every day and never see anything else. That's not the world we all grew up in if you're my age. I was born in '62. Most of you look as though you were a bit younger, but I think most of us grew up at a time when there was that kind of fireplace moment where we checked in on what the 3 national networks in the United States were saying, and we had a kind of national conversation. That's gone. That's gone completely. We go to where we want to go. We're told what we want to hear, specifically because very smart marketing people know that if we tell you what you want to hear, you'll come back tomorrow for more. That's how it works today. I think that has damaged the kind of tenor of our political debate, but it's not debilitating. It's not debilitating. The story that we hear now, though, is of the rise of rival economic powers and of the inevitable decline of the United States. Mathematically, I think you have to recognize that a relative decline in the dominance of the United States economy and the United States in many other facets is inevitable. That's going to happen. That's math. But the idea that the United States is in some kind of spiral, death spiral, that the U.S. economy, even with its own self-inflicted wounds, is not going to remain the most dynamic economy in the world, that's really hard for me to fathom. I can't understand how people could look at the numbers and come to that conclusion. The scale of the United States, the things that the United States accomplishes by accident on its back in the midst of the last recession. Let's just take quick stock. We came up with a number of things that I regard as disruptive and adaptive innovations. Okay, so just for a short list, Twitter and Facebook, which are not just things that our children play with. These are things that topple dictatorships. Now, that doesn't mean they're always going to be directed in a good way. They can be annoying, they can be dangerous, but they can also empower people all over the world. That's an enormous change that took place while we were in a recession. The smartphone, effectively. Weaponized drones, whatever you think of them. They were invented to adapt to a new reality, and they are almost entirely an American innovation. Fracking, essentially, while the concept has been around, it's come to fruition at a time when the United States was being told it's flat on its back, and here goes China and India and Brazil, forget it, you're done. It's an absurdity. Each one of these things is changing dramatically the realities of the world. All of them the fruits of a very dynamic culture that has the ability to self-correct, that is very self-critical, tends to be transparent, regardless of what Mr. Snowden might say, and is still the most dynamic economy in the world. So I feel as though that's the little corrective moment in my talk here. We do have problems. I'd like to address some of them. They are not as severe as we think. In many ways, our biggest problem is our tendency to panic and to run toward a very simple solution, simple draconian solution to rather complex problems. And I'll get more of that later. But let's talk about our core competitors, our economic competitors out there. Those of you, all of you, know that capital flows from the big emerging market powers, which were flowing in the direction of those powers for a variety of reasons, in many cases because of what the Federal Reserve was doing here in the US, are now flowing this way in a fierce kind of counter tide to what happened after 2008. If you many of you will know that EB5, projects are on the rise. This is the kind of harbinger of these tidal waves of money from the emerging markets that are coming back to the United States, where not only is there relatively robust growth, but there's also safety. There's a lack of risk. There's regulatory and currency risk right now is on fire in the emerging markets. Where I work at Control Risks, we also deal very importantly with the corruption risk that is out in the world right now, and the fact that you have political risk that is almost unfathomable, which can really upset your business in a sudden change. If we look at what happened in Egypt, speaking of Twitter and Facebook, it was almost impossible to predict that. For years and years and years and years, people had talked about Hosni Mubarak being ultimately, displaced by something, but whether anybody could actually put their finger on when it happened was another question. But you can prepare for such things. If you've got investments in a country like that, if you employ locals, if you're concerned about business continuity issues post-crisis, those are things that you can workshop, you can scenario and analyze, and that's the kind of work we do at Control Risks in those places. But from this kind of roughly negative talk about the United States, I think we must take a more realistic approach. And to me, the realistic approach is partly based on this innovative penchant we have. It's partly based on the kind of faith that a man like my father has in the country, that it ultimately will do the right thing. But to me, more empirically, it's based on something that's very important to all of you, and that's demographics. Lost in all the talk about the BRICS and our competition with other players like Japan and Germany and the EU is the fact that America remains a young country that's growing very quickly. UNDP, which does population estimates out in the out years, looks right now at the top 30 countries, and there'll be some significant changes over the next 25, 30 years. The United States is expected to grow by 2050 at a 28% clip. That's very good. That's the profile of a young, vital country, not a Russia, which is supposed to sink by 17% in population, Japan, 15% in population, Germany, 13% in population. Even China will only grow by 2% for a variety of reasons, mostly to do with their one-child policies. And India's robust growth has its own downside because they've gender skewed their population. They will have an army of unmarried men. Literally hundreds of thousands of men for whom there is no cohort because of the selective abortions that have been used using ultrasound. Those type of things are liabilities that are generational liabilities. That'll take a long time to unravel for the Indian economy, for the Indian political sphere. It's a very dangerous thing to have a lot of unmarried, angry men running around. Just come to Hoboken, New Jersey some night. But I think more importantly, we fall in love with these crazy simplistic notions like the BRICS. I'm not the first to say this. I think I was very soon saying it when I saw that term, but Russia as a BRIC is just absurd. It really is. Here's a country that's going to decline in population by 17%, which has endured a brain drain that is astounding. So many recent Nobel Prize winners in the United States are actually Russian. Sergey Brin, who founded Google, is a Russian. I could go on and on in the tech industry. Russia is not a good, easy place to do business. We have plenty of people who do business and make money well there. But it is not a place that Russians feel they can plot their own future reliably. And those with the talent are voting with their feet. Optimism, which I'm trying to exude here amidst all this gloom, is not something that comes naturally to the Russians either. And I know you probably have heard this, but I'm going to say it anyway. The Russians have this kind of pessimistic, reputation, and the Pessimism of Russia, you'll have one guy who says, how could this possibly get worse? But, the Russian optimist will say, well, of course it can get worse. And this is the kind of prevailing attitude toward things, because things are fixed. Things are fixed. There are ways of doing things that are very difficult to get around unless you're in power. We're lucky in Canada, in the United States, in most of Europe, in Japan to some extent. This is not the operating reality. We can creatively change very basic things. Let's go back to fracking for a second. I spent some time about a year and a half ago with the guy who was then the acting finance minister of Russia, now the finance minister full time. And we talked about fracking a bit. And he was going on and on about the vast, shale oil deposits underneath Russia. And this is all true. But I said, okay, well, let's look at what fracking is, okay? Because it's not done by Exxon, it's not done by Chevron, it's not done by BP. Fracking is a bunch of wildcatters, for lack of a better term, who drill every day, look at what the results are, file a new plan with the state the next day, say, we need to change a little bit the mix of the liquids we're putting down there, we need new trucks from here. They're cost control fanatics because the margins are slim. So you have a regulatory environment that's flexible. You've got cost controls that are really strict and efficient. You've got infrastructure that's flexible. You can bring in different trucks very quickly. You can offload efficiently things you were using you don't need to use anymore. They're not just going to sit there. I said to him, what in that sounds like Russia to you? I said, now, I think you will go into the Arctic and you'll build a city where there wasn't one before and you'll produce oil. Absolutely. The Russians are really good at that. That is a core talent. That's why they were in the space race. Big projects they can do. But this kind of revolutionary capitalism is not in the DNA. And I think we have to recognize that this is something that goes unremarked upon too often in the United States. There's too much talk about what's wrong with our capitalism, not enough talk about what's right with it. There is a lot wrong with it. I'll get to that. As capital flows have reversed now, we've seen the emerging markets begin to struggle a bit. The emerging markets are never again going to be off the radar of big multinational corporations or anyone who's looking to make money. These are going to be places where growth is more robust because they're coming from a lower base, where middle classes, and in particular urbanization, the urban middle classes, are exploding. In those numbers I'd cited before when we were talking about the United States as a 401 million person country in 2050. Obviously, India and China are above us in the 1.5 billion range, with India on top in those UN projections. Number 3, though, is a bit of a surprise. Anybody know who's going to overtake the United States in that period, according to the UN? Nigeria. Nigeria is exploding. Whether it can manage that explosion, we'll see. But what's exploding is urbanization. Urbanization in Nigeria is astounding. I witnessed it myself a year ago. It is both the best thing and the most perilous thing that could happen to a country like Nigeria. On the one hand, it puts together the groups that that left apart could destroy the country. There's a lot of ethnic and religious angst in Nigeria, to put it nicely. But it also creates economies of scale. It creates demands on government. It creates demands for development. People want to live in decent houses. The bank I was working for at the time was building middle class, not charitable basic housing, but middle class housing outside Accra in Ghana and outside Nairobi in Kenya. This is almost unheard of still to this day in Africa, and yet the middle class in Africa exists. So there is a revolution going on there, but it's going to take a long time for African incomes to get to the point where you can compare the size of the US economy and GDP and the size of the Chinese economy and GDP and have that mean anything. The reality is per capita GDP, the amount of money the average Chinese person has versus the amount of money the average American person has, it's just apples and oranges. And then you add the innovation piece, and I think we are far too gloomy about our economy. By the way, another thing we invented while we were flat on our back, I think, was REITs, right? It's not a bad invention. Even when financial innovation is being torn down, we're innovating. We're re-innovating, maybe, or renovating. So it's a very dynamic thing. It is a source of enormous optimism for me in the American project. Geopolitically, we should also remember that the BRICS, as they're called, they lack mortar, to put it simply. These are not countries that care about one another very much until they get together in that showy summit that they hold every year. So the Brazilians and the Indians are, there's a big debate going on there, how closely to align with the United States. But none of them are saying, let's do intelligence cooperation with the Chinese and the Russians. That's not on the table. So in this big kind of geopolitical power sense, those are countries that have very different interests, very different problems. India is the world's largest democracy. It's voting next month. It's going to be an unbelievable carnival of chaos. It's going to produce a government, though, reliably, as it has since the late 1940s. Russia has elections, too. Let's talk for a second about risks. So I tend to, again, this is my baggage. I'm from Jersey. So when I look for something to define where I think things are, sometimes it comes right from my backyard. And there's a very nice song by Bruce Springsteen a couple of years back called "My Own Worst Enemy Has Come to Town." And that's, of course, yourself, right? I think, in many ways, the only thing that stands between the United States and a second American century, to put it in somewhat pompous terms, is the United States. We have an incredible ability to oversimplify and then sell that oversimplification to the public in a way that makes bad policy inevitable. The Iraq War was a very difficult situation for everybody in my country to deal with. The polls were amazing. The number of people who supported the war at one point was near 70%. And if you ask today, how many of you supported the war, that number is somewhere in the 30%. No one likes to be duped, and no one likes to admit it. That's a very difficult moment in American foreign policy. It will take a while to regain the reputation, reputational damage it caused. Similarly, the Lehman, it gets tagged as the Lehman moment, but for lack of a better term, the financial crisis, financial innovation, a breakdown in regulation, regulatory bodies that really couldn't affect things, incentives that were out of whack. These are things that we can recover from. We have in many ways. But the idea that we can't see them as they're happening is a little scary. That's the problem that I see in the United States, is that we fall in love with our own BS. And we can't pull back just for a second and say, well, let's look at this just for a second. Let's just do the other scenario. Let's take in an alternative scenario. What if one of these banks collapses? No, that was considered heresy. Come on, don't be silly. When it happened, supposedly we've learned the lesson. I think that's true. The point of this is, I think it's really important now that we internalize without politicizing the lessons of that. I think the leverage ratios have to go up. I think leverage, if we are going to continue to allow middle-class people in the United States to buy homes, to dream dreams, leverage has to survive. And for leverage to survive, banks have to be prudent. It's not hard. Everybody in Canada gets it. Banks have to be prudent. Some can innovate, but if banks are not prudent, the damage that will ultimately be done to the brand of home ownership is going to be brutal. It's come and gone now, and it's very clear that people are going to buy houses again. This has not reversed that basic animal appetite that has been in the U.S. for generations, and it's such an important part of wealth creation of anyone's idea of how they're going to retire, because it ain't going to be your 401k. So That's really important. But we can't do it again. We can't have it happen again. And that means the banks have to be watched. Not nickeled and dimed, but watched. Let me give you a sense of, now we're getting into the difficult stuff where I'm criticizing my country. There is such a thing, I think the politicization, I'm not even going to use that term now. The debate has been politicized over this concept of income inequality. But the numbers show it exists, okay? Let's just say that. I was thinking about doing a book on this. I decided not to. But in the first chapter, it was going to start, as many of my stories do with my family, at 16 Bender Drive in Clifton, New Jersey in 1967, where my father, then making $12,000 a year, bought a house for $18,000, okay? He had no debt. A lot of people didn't have a lot of debt in those days. He had a little bit, but not much, maybe a car loan. And he bought this cute little 2-bedroom, thing, probably built in the late 40s. It's still there. It was sold in 2013 for $287,000. Now, in 1967, the average salary was $9,000 in Clifton, New Jersey. Today, it's $53,000. The math's not hard to do. It took twice the average salary to buy that house in 1967. It takes 6 times, almost, today. Leverage has to survive. Banks need to be prudent, or that does not work. We can't have people failing in that situation. The good thing is, I think that leverage ratios have gone up. There's some hemming and hawing about it, but it's happening. The United States learns from its mistakes. I'm optimistic about it. I get on a train every day that makes me feel really proud to be in the United States. The train starts in this kind of horse farm area in northeast New Jersey, where you get these people who are really, they look like executives. They're coming in, many of them probably families that have been there for hundreds of years. And as it makes its way through New Jersey, it goes through areas where recently arrived Russian and Polish immigrants get on the train in towns like Fair Lawn and Passaic. And then you get Patterson, where you get Hispanics and African Americans. And then we get to the inner core, as we get closer and closer to Manhattan, through Clifton, we get to the inner core of little suburbs outside New York that had been beaten up in the days when people were moving further from the city, but are now being renovated. And you see the yuppies getting on in places like Rutherford and Lyndhurst and Secaucus. My God, Secaucus was a slaughterhouse when I was growing up. It's amazing to see. And these people riding this train to Manhattan, that is such an optimistic thing to me. Some people would look at that and go, this isn't America. This looks like a refugee camp. Sometimes it does. The weather's been rough this winter. To me, I don't see struggling, angry, mob-like people on that train. I see people on their way to their dream. I see people on their way to their work, doing things for the future, for the kids. I see my dad. He's looking for his bicycle. That's it. I'd love to take some questions. Thank you. I've been told that there are microphones. You probably know by now the protocol, but I'm going to put my glasses on because the glare is really amazing. Yes, can you say who you are before your questions, and I will do my best.
Hi, my name is Alexander Calamaros, live in Los Angeles, California. I think you said politicization in there somewhere.
Yes.
But I didn't, did I miss where you tried to take on the polarization of politicization and the lack of, let's say, government officials, in particular Congress, to work together?
Yeah, I think, that's a great question. I think one of the things that's changed since I came into the workforce, roughly the mid-'80s, again, some of which is based on the media and the channels of discourse that we have, which were once filtered by what we considered adults, even if we didn't like them, if we thought they were left or right-leaning, whatever we thought, corporate shills, whatever the language of the day was. I think the reality now is that the internet in particular, but cable news as well, and radio has undergone its own small revolution, has created a kind of megaphone of millions. Now, if you look at this from the point of view of a healthy democratic society, it's hard to say that that's a bad thing. But it also empowers the loudest person in the room. And we've all been in rooms where there's one squeaky wheel who just dominates only because they have no shame, really. And I think the problem is we don't have any arbiter anymore. Journalism doesn't do the job anymore. The political parties don't seem to feel they have the skin in the game to do this, to name and shame when someone has stepped over the line, except when it's really politically advantageous. No one does it, and there's no high-mindedness in it, and it bothers me. And where there is high-mindedness, it tends to be in some small niche where high-minded people go to complain about the world, and it doesn't help. So I have no solution for that. I wish there was a national moment. I think the Super Bowl might be it now, sadly. But a national moment in the United States where we really do see the same thing at the same time, and there's a conversation about it. Too often it tends to be a school shooting or just a spectacular event of some sort that really doesn't get us talking about the deeper issues. I hope that answers it.
How about, well, one follow-up might be, as a geostrategist, do you see any other political system worldwide, or perhaps more regional, local forms of governance that have any promise to do any better?
What I do see in some societies, and I've lived around the world, I've lived in Germany, I've lived in the UK, several stints in the UK, I know from experience that attacking government for the sake of attacking government, I think sometimes is a self-defeating aspect of American democracy. There are times when government is absolutely the least efficient possible way to do something, but there are also times when the only person who would ever bother to do it is government. And that's just a basic dilemma. We have to deal with that fact. We should hold government accountable, but the idea that government is purely malicious, I think, crosses the line into self-defeating, a self-defeating attitude rather than being productive and saying, this could be done better this way. I would rather see more of that conversation. And I think you see some more of that. Well, Canada is an excellent example of that. I think you see more of that I saw that in Germany. There's all sorts of things in Germany that I couldn't stand. The bankers would ask me why I wanted to transfer money, for instance. What's this for? I said, well, it's my money. It's none of your business. But, with the good comes the bad, One of the wonderful things in Germany is you would go to a pharmacy late at night I had a baby who needed medicine, and if the pharmacy was closed, they were required to list which pharmacy in the neighborhood would be open 24/7. That's a pretty useful thing. Very intrusive on one hand. Governmentally, it's a bit of a nitpick, but it's very useful. So I think there are societies that try to do a little more on that end, and where government has not taken on this enormous freight of malicious evil that we've got in the United States, which is, I think, unfortunate.
Nicely put.
Thanks. Yes, sir.
Marty Stern, Chicago. Two questions. You went through a whole discussion of demographics without once mentioning immigration. Can you talk about the importance, or maybe lack of importance, of that as you feel? And the second is, in a globalized world where ideas get around so quickly, is it still important who has the first idea and where the idea is generated?
I'll take the second one first. Yes, it's very important. Increasingly, intellectual property theft is becoming more difficult to avoid on the one hand, but it's also becoming easier to prosecute. The fact that, for instance, China is now part of the WTO, they are very concerned when a serious case arises where there's some issue of intellectual property that's been taken. Similarly, again, if I go back to the fracking example, you can go on any American university that has a degree in engineering, and they'll tell you how to frack. There'll be a diagram, maybe even an interactive. The trick is in doing it, and the trick is in being able to execute this incredibly difficult series of intellectual, engineering, and infrastructure things all at once without losing your shirt. And that's where the U.S. tends to be good. We're a laboratory. Immigration, okay, my dad obviously was an immigrant. I think immigration is one of those issues that has gotten absolutely lost in the shouting between the two parties. Immigration is a big part of that healthy demographic picture we have. I think the people I ride that train to New York on with, probably 1/3 of them may be born in another country. There's not a consensus in the United States about how we should feel about that as a culture. I can't help but embrace it. I don't see it as a danger to me. Illegal immigration is another issue. In that case, you are undercutting American workers, and to the extent that we can rationalize and systematize immigration to the benefit of our economy and our culture, that makes sense. But the idea that it's some kind of a unwashed horde that's diluting American culture, I think is crazy given our history. We are mostly immigrants after all. Yes, sir.
Hi, I'm Dave Christensen from the San Francisco Bay Area. And one commentator said that real estate is an industry with 10-year cycles and 5-year memories. Many of us sitting in this room saw the boom of, say, 2007 and the bust of 2008, where values dropped by 40% in many areas. And that's a reason for the malaise or the kind of the attitude that you've referred to. In your optimistic vision of the future, do you see a time when the economy will return to that level of robustness, even though some of it may not have been real?
I think we have to be careful what we wish for. And we have to remember that Brazil's economy growing at, let's say we go back a few years, it was growing in the 7 to 8% range, is really equal to the US economy growing at 3%. It takes a long time for the Brazilian economy to generate the US GDP. That's a 10-year process in Brazil. There's a lot of economic activity in a US growth rate of 3%. Our potential growth rate, there was a lot of debate about whether the 2008 crash had actually damaged potential growth, this kind of bizarre economist's concept of what is the ultimate, optimal growth rate that a country can attain. It had always been thought to be maybe 3.5% for a country as sophisticated and mature as the United States. I had tended to think that potential growth might have been damaged, that we might not grow quite as quickly because we needed now to suddenly buttress some of what we thought had been safe bets with regulatory or tradecraft changes that would inevitably cause a slight lowering of potential growth. So I think it isn't likely you'll see long periods of time of 4.5% American growth. But in pockets, again, the demographic is the demographic. Who's going to we're now at 312 million. We're going to get to 401 in 2050. Where are these people going to live? Those houses don't exist. I don't care. I remember there was a time they were talking about maybe we should knock down some of these new houses to save the housing market. That's a very, pure laboratory type idea. But believe me, someone's going to live in those houses. There are people coming. And so that is the great cheery fact of the American economy, really. We will have generations of new families and new workers and new people to educate and new people to innovate. I hope that helped. Yes, sir.
Good morning. My name's Pike Oliver. I'm from Seattle. And in the U.S., we're spending a significantly greater portion of our GDP on healthcare than Canada or the Western European countries, and apparently getting results that aren't much better. You've given us some calmly presented optimism this morning. Can you give us something that is cause for optimism that we're going to get that under control?
I think, that is in the same vortex as immigration in many ways. One of the things I wrote a couple of years ago, and I think it was a dangerous thing to say, and I think it actually played out fairly well, is that when I was a reporter, I would occasionally call the CIA. And the CIA would play this game with us on whether they were talking to us on the record or off the record, and whether they were really telling us something. And I wrote a story, and the guy called me back the next day very angry, and he said, left to your own devices, you would destroy this country, he said to me, because of what I had written. And I said, I feel exactly the same way about you. And this is how I feel about the healthcare debate. We didn't have the greatest system in the world. We had a system that left a lot of people out. Something had to be done. This is probably not the best fix in the world. The two sides prevented the worst and the best, and we have now what we have. And I think that is basically what happened after the global economy nearly collapsed too. Is it the best reform? Is it the most efficient? Will it encourage growth in the most optimal way? No. But the two sides prevented the others from doing either the most draconian cuts that would have probably deepened the recession, or spending in astronomical ways that would have made our structural debt much worse and much more difficult to tackle in the out years. So I tend to think that in that case, if you take the words and the shouting away, American democracy is still working.
John Ward from Boulder, Colorado, and we don't talk about the Super Bowl. I'm interested in your opinion about whether the U.S. currency will remain the world's reserve currency, and if not, there's some people who say it wouldn't be just one other currency, but many. But if that does happen, what do you see as the ramifications?
That's something I've written quite a bit about, actually. There is nothing anywhere that says that that trade should be denominated in dollars, okay? But the U.S. does tend to act as if there is somewhere some document that says we are the reserve currency and the Fed is the keeper of the reserve. There is no rival to the reserve currency. And every time someone, raises the idea, it's either laughed out of the room, as when Medvedev mentioned that possibly the ruble, or when Bitcoin a couple of months ago was in its bubble stage, and is now seen to be what it is, a very promising, interesting experiment that would be disastrous as a term of trade globally. So the dollar is the king, and it will be for a while. What will destroy the dollar, though, and this is where we get to the basket of currency idea, which is out there, is if we have a couple more of these we're going to default moments. That's just, and once again, this is where democracy kind of worked if you stripped away what people were actually saying. And I can't really tell whether anybody intended really to bring the United States to the point where it would default on its debt. That's a cataclysmic event. Not just because the markets will tumble, et cetera. We've been through that before. More importantly, that will get the central bankers of the Russians and the Germans and the Brazilians and they're going to go, these people are nuts. We've got to do something. They will work on this. They're wargaming it, I promise you. They're all wondering, how can we do this? The euro would have been a much more powerful rival had they not had their own kind of existential moment recently. But there's probably a way to put a basket of currencies together that include the dollar, that for some of these countries outside the U.S. influence, they will feel protects them from too much reliance on the dollar and effectively too much reliance on policy of the Federal Reserve, because they're in chaos right now as we taper. That's been very difficult for the emerging markets to deal with, and they really have no alternative. So they will figure out a way to get a voice in that debate. Yes, sir.
My name is Patrick Devereaux. I'm from Denver, Colorado. Can you comment a little bit about the weakness in the United States education system, the low percentage of kids that are graduating from high school and college, and the economic impact that that has, or the negative impact that that has for our country to be able to compete economically globally going into the future?
Yeah, in economic terms, we call this human capital. It's a horrible term in some ways, but it is what, writ large, what a strategy group at a big company looks at when it decides to move into a country. What's the human capital? Where am I going to get my workforce? Am I going to have to train them to read in some cases? Are they numerate? These are big questions. These should not be questions here. Unfortunately, they are questions here. And so what has tended to happen here is we get two kinds of reaction. We get No Child Left Behind, and then tweaks to that where tests get less or more influence on the performance of students. They tend to be giant macro political policies that are very difficult to argue from a results standpoint, because these things take time. Maybe they work, maybe they don't. Or you get the kind of public-private partnership model, which tends to focus very intensely on either an inner city area, on a particular region. Those tend to show results more quickly, but they only deal with certain areas. So you're leaving enormous parts of the country untouched. What you're seeing in New York City right now is a really interesting test case. De Blasio, a very populist mayor who replaced Bloomberg, is, he's made his political kind of brand doing things for the forgotten middle class of New York, the Brooklyn, Bronx, Queens, Staten Island crowd, where he portrays, of course, Mike Bloomberg as the Manhattan guy, who was all about charter schools, all about spending on the arts, et cetera, but forgetting that, out in the outer boroughs, where the kids were struggling to create, basic reading and writing abilities. This is going to play out in its usual way. The teachers' unions will have more pull in the de Blasio administration. I'm not sure that's such a great thing. Charter schools are a huge political issue in New York right now, and there's a lot of money being spent on airtime in New York City media to argue both ways. But amidst it all, the one thing that's happening is that de Blasio has, and now Andrew Cuomo, the governor, has said, one thing that data seems unquestionably to tell us is that if you get kids into school before kindergarten, they tend to excel. They do a lot better, and they read at a much earlier age. They read and write, and they learn arithmetic more competently. And so I think we're seeing experiments that make sense. It's not just about whether or not we need to spend on education, but how we should spend. And that's a good sign, because the U.S. does need to do that, and especially if it's going to continue to grow at that pace.
Michael, thank you. We probably need to wrap up.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your attendance this morning. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.